Start recording. And we'll go. Alrighty, so welcome to session 4. So today we're going to be talking about licensing and getting different resources from online, and then how to use other people's resources in your own projects. The first little bit would be maybe a little bit boring, but hopefully the end will be a little bit more exciting. So one thing to keep in mind as we're going through these slides, from the last time, because we inserted the extra session in between session 2 and session 3, these files, if you previously had downloaded them from the GitHub, it will be in the day 3 folder, not the day 4 folder. So just keep that in mind when we're referencing the numbers, that the numbers are relative to the new numbers, not the old numbers. So if you want to try and find them, you can find them there. Okay, so as a refresher, last time we talked a little bit about Bootstrap, and we talked a bit about JavaScript, the basic syntax, and using all the document and window and element objects. So to start off with, I'll start off with a quick question about JavaScript. So given the code here, where you have a div that has an ID of content, and you have a paragraph tag and an anchor tag inside here, what are the steps that a function would need to do in order to return the URL of the anchor tag? So that'll be a quick question that'll be popping up in a second here. Alrighty. Looks like we have the pull on there. Okay, so for this one, yeah, it would be both B and C. So in this case, B was locating the anchor tag by either the tag name or by the parent div, and then returning the element.get attribute of the href. So that would be essentially going right here, trying to find this div, which would be pretty easy because it has an ID, which makes it super handy to try and find it. And then inside that div, going through and trying to locate the anchor tag through there, and then returning the href attribute using .get attribute. Or you can do the exact same process, except for instead of returning .get attribute, you can just do .href, because in this case, like I said before, elements are objects. So if you want to access their attributes, you can do it directly by just doing dot and then whatever the attribute is. Okay, now we have one more question to do with Bootstrap, which is, what is the layout with this code that you're looking at on screen? Okay, looks like we were a bit more split on that one. So that one, the answer was B. So in this case, it would be that the first row would have it would have 3 4-column like divs at all sizes, because if you remember, the call doesn't ever shrink at all. So whenever you're shrinking it down, it'll just stay at 3 no matter what. And then the second one would have 4 sets of 6 columns each, so 50-50, where they'd sit side by side each other, up until you hit the small size, at which point they would expand to 12. And those 4 would basically be stacked so that you'd have like 2 here and then 2 below it, because it would overflow, is what would happen there. So that's what it would be for those 2. So just keep that in mind for when we're going forward from here. And so with that, what we're going to do now is there is some starter code inside the day 4 folder, or alternatively, just because the names all got a little bit mixed up, you can actually just click the link directly here, and this will take you straight to the page where you can just copy and paste it if you really want to. And essentially what you're going to try and do here is you're going to try to recreate this page that we have right here for you. So As we're going through, there's going to be 3 cards that are going to be there, and then they're going to start off being 4 columns each until you hit the medium size, and then 12 columns when small. So I'll give you guys a chance to give that a go. So I'll just restart up the recording. So I'll just quickly open this up. So this is the code that you were given to start with, which is just the standard sort of Bootstrap starter code. And then from there, basically what you're looking for was to add in 3 cards into here. So if we go ahead and we open up the link in here, basically this first card would work. So what you can do in here is just grab this. And what I typically recommend is putting it inside of a column. So you can just do div.col. And then in this case, I think it was dash medium dash 6. And then we'd want call dash medium dash 12 is what it would be. And then dash call dash large dash 6. And that'll give you one that has a call medium 12 and a call large 6. We can go ahead, we can paste that in there, make sure to get rid of this width. And then basically you can just copy paste that 2 more times. And if we refresh, we'll see we have 3 cards there with the 6. Sorry, we don't want 6, we want 4. So we get to change that down to 4. And then basically what we're looking for here is a card that has, when it gets to the large or above, it goes to 4. And then when it's medium or below, it goes to 12, which is what we have there. And then you can just copy paste the link into there for the image and you're good to go. Okay. So now the most fun topic, how to steal like a developer. So as we've seen so far, most developers don't tend to write their own code. Generally speaking, you're going to want to build on top of things that already exist for a ton of different reasons. As we've seen with CSS frameworks, they bring a whole bunch of advantages. And on top of that, when you're sort of when you're building any project in general, you're often going to use a lot of projects that are going to previously exist, and then you're going to build with those pieces, sort of like Lego blocks, to build up your project from there. And that's where open source comes in. So the idea with open source is that people should know what's running on their devices. And as a byproduct of that, oftentimes what it means is that people will have the actual source code to their projects out in the open so that people can use them and build on top of them and iterate on top of them as they want. Just one thing to keep in mind, when you see something that says open source online, it doesn't always mean it's free. You might have to pay for it. So just keep that in mind whenever people say that they have something that's open source. It doesn't just mean that it's freely available for anybody to use. Just before anybody goes out there and sees somebody say something about they have open source website templates and it's like $150 a site, just be warned ahead of time. So if we already have a well-designed site, why not just take it? So as we've seen, you can sort of like get people's code directly from the website and just pull it down and download it from there. So why don't people just do that? Why don't they just take people's websites and just go from there? Well, there's a little pesky problem called lawsuits. And basically what happens is that if you go ahead and you steal somebody's code and you do all this sort of stuff, you can run into lots of legal problems, which is where licensing which is the topic for today, comes into play. So since I'm guessing nobody said yes, nobody's a huge fan of being sued, this is where licensing and copyright comes in. So today we're just going to be coming and talking mostly about licensing. Copyright is a thing that does exist. We're not going to cover it a whole bunch today. And also just keep in mind when we're going through this, these slides have been read over by lawyers, but we're not lawyers. So whenever you have any questions about anything or is anything more serious where you're going to do like actual like selling things, go and talk to a lawyer. It's going to be much easier than dealing with this, but just keeping these things in mind will help you avoid some of the common problems that people run into. I know personally people who have built websites using projects that had licenses before, and then they've had the company come back and charge them for it afterwards. So I personally watched this happen to other people, which is why I'm bringing it up today. Before you start going out and just downloading stuff, be careful what you're doing. Okay, so yeah, like I said, why care? Again, lawsuits are one thing, but also they can force you to take your projects down. So if somebody has the license to something, they can force you to take it down. Or alternatively, what they can do is they can tithe anything that you have. So if you start selling something, so if you guys start going out there making websites, people can basically take any of the money that you've earned from those websites because of the fact that you use code beyond the licensing terms. And they can charge you for more than those, the amount of money that you've made as well. On top of that, just be very careful. So we're going to talk about several common licenses that exist in the open source world and go from there. If something doesn't have a license on it, generally speaking, just don't use it. It's going to be much easier. If they don't have the terms out there, don't use it at all. So the first one is GPL and Apache. So these licenses basically let you use your project commercially and in open source, so you can use them however you want. But keep in mind that you have to actually disclose your source code. So if you write a website using GPL3 code, you have to then release your website as GPL or Apache. So that means that basically if you use if you use code from these projects, your code also has to be under these licenses. And so obviously the problem with that is that if you want to sell something and you don't want people to know what the code is, if you use one of these projects, now you have to make sure that the code is out there. So just be careful when you're using these. MIT, generally speaking, is going to be pretty much you can do whatever you want with it unless it's otherwise stated. The only thing you have to do is make sure you keep the license file or any license indicators with the code when you use it yourself. But most projects on GitHub that you see that have MIT, basically you can just take it and you can use it as you need to. Same thing with Creative Commons. We see something that says Creative Commons on there, make sure to double check. But most of the time when you have Creative Commons stuff, you can pretty much just use it. They have a tool that lets you see what they look like. So if we go ahead and click this, you can see here on here, it'll like let you click and see, oh, what is this Attribution 4.0 international license? And it tells you basically what you're allowed to do. Anything that has the word attribution in it basically means you have to put somewhere on your website, like the footer, which we talked about last time. You just need to put in there who created it. So you just say something like, hey, this site was originally created by X, Y, and Z, and now you're good to use that code without having to pay them for it. We're not going to worry about this one as much, but copyleft is the idea with the GPL and the Apache that I talked about earlier, where basically everything that you create that uses those licenses has to also include those licenses and be used under those licenses. So if you make a project and you're using GPL code, you have to make your project GPL and all that sort of stuff, or something that's GPL compatible. So just keep that in mind whenever you're writing code. You have to be very careful with anything that's called a copyleft license, because it basically means this is the really bad way of saying it, but like it's basically like a virus. The second that it gets into a code base, it sort of expands out from there. So just be very careful when you're using other people's code if they have GPL to make sure that you're not in violation of the licensing terms. Currently, right now, there's a lawsuit in Germany going on with a company called Stockfish, and I forget what the other company is, but they're suing them because basically they use their product and they're using a GPL license, and basically they didn't do this. None of their code was disclosed, and now they're being sued for a ton of money. So just keep that in mind. The basics are copyright applies to an actual thing. So that means that like if you have something where somebody has like a logo or something like that, that applies to like an actual thing. And then copyleft is something that, as I said before, kind of gets passed along based on what you use. So something can also be open source and still have copyright. So for example, if Facebook releases the source code to something, that doesn't mean you can say that like you can start using Facebook's logo everywhere in your code. So just keep that in mind as well as you're going through this. And if you're ever wondering, well, okay, I'm just going to not do this on any of my projects. I'm not putting a license on there. Super bad idea if you're ever releasing your code anywhere. There's a ton of different laws about this, but basically if you don't actually include a license on your code, you can be stuck with a ton of terms that are called implied license terms. They're really bad. The main one being warranty. I don't know about you, but my code that I often release publicly is really bad. So if it has any bugs, you're now legally liable for any of those bugs if they cause any problems on people's systems. So basically, if you're not sure what to do, just use MIT for your projects and just stick to only using other people's MIT code. That's the easiest way to go about this. That's basically the long and short TLDR of this entire rant is if you can, stick to MIT, stick to other people's projects being MIT, and go from there. Work your way out from there as you need to go, but try and keep that as much as possible. It'll be much easier for you in the long run. And that is why we've been using Bootstrap. So Bootstrap has an MIT license, which is why we can use it in any projects we want. But it also has some extra stuff included on that license as well, which is that you can't claim that you own Bootstrap. So I can't go out and say like, I own Bootstrap, I created it. And then the same thing with that I was talking about with warranty. If anything breaks because of it, not their problem. And you have to include the details, the MIT license that's included in the files whenever you distribute any new code. So you'll see whenever you download the Bootstrap CSS file, there's actually the licenses included directly in there as well. Okay. So that was kind of the boring stuff out of the way, but hopefully that'll help you when you're trying to download things online. If you go onto like these different theme websites and HTML template stuff that we're going to be talking about now, which is where you can basically go out and download like full websites you can use in your own projects. You want to watch out for these things that I talked about previously, and just be careful when you're downloading these things because there's entire companies dedicated to making this more complicated so that you run into problems and then they like sue you down the road. Just be very careful when you're using templates that you're using them correctly. So like I was saying, CSS frameworks are great. You can use them for a ton of stuff. Bootstrap is great, but it doesn't make it any easier to actually design a site. As you saw last time, even just the basic thing of putting text into columns is not necessarily the most obvious thing for you to just look at and see. And so actually doing a good design, like these designs that you see here, making it look nice, do all that stuff is oftentimes really hard. And so that's where things like HTML templates can come in and be super handy to use whenever you're trying to go out and do like larger projects. If you just have something that you want to whip up really quickly, super nice to just pull out an HTML template and start building off of that so that you know that the design works and all that stuff and where it's going to go from there. So there's a ton of different sites that let you use HTML templates. You have to be really careful. A lot of the licensing stuff that I talked about previously is because when you're going out and downloading this code, you have to be really careful about which sites you're using. But that being said, when you can find sites that have good licenses, there you can see the examples on the right-hand side here are super nice. Fun fact, actually, that hyperspace site that's down in the bottom right was the original template that was used to build the first Shulk Unite website. The sidebar was turned black, and then everything on the other side was turned white, and it was just given the Shulk Unite colors, and then you could just basically go down from there. So actually good websites that you can use to get your templates from. The first one here is HTML5up. So HTML5up, if we actually just click on this, you can see here when we go on here, there are a ton of these that we can see. So you can see from the example here, if we go into the Dimension Live demo here, this is basically what it would look like. And we can go through and see exactly how this would look if we want to use this one. And then on top of that, if we're coming down here, you can just basically click and download a zip file of the file contents and start messing around with them from there. So if we're taking a look at like Ethereal, for example, we can click and we can see a live demo of it. We can see like, oh, wow, cool. This is what it looks like on here. We can go ahead, we can click and see the tablet view if we wanted to, see what it would look like if it was on a tablet, see what it would look like on mobile. And now we can see all that stuff. And then we can come up here and we can actually download it. And what it'll download is just a zip file that we can go ahead and open. And we can see here, there are just some files. So I'll just grab this and I'll put it in here. New folder, Ethereal. And now if I open up this index file, we can see here, this is what we currently have to work with as a base to start building out our website. So from here, then basically it's just a matter of determining how this stuff is set up and just starting to build from here. But now we actually know what the design looks like. We know the design works well, and we can start building from it from here. And then the only requirement with these files based on license is that you have to give attribution. So essentially, if we come into here and we hit F12, for example, to take a look at this, you can see at the very top, when Microsoft is not asking me for stuff, we can see at the top here, it says Ethereal by HTML5up. And you can basically use them as you see fit. So you can use these for whatever projects you want, as long as this comment stays at the top. So if we go back into VS Code, for example, and we pop open that index file, you can see at the top here, as long as this stays at the top here, we're good to go. We can remove the other references to it, like we can change the title, we can change all this stuff, but this has to stay at the top here so that people know that this is where we got it from. So keep in mind with HTML5up, which we have here, that they are written in pure CSS and JavaScript, pure CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. So as we're taking a look at this file itself, you can see here that each of these has a section element, and then it has its own classes and all this stuff. So it's set up in a very custom way. And this is what you'll find with a lot of developed sites, is that they're developed using custom CSS that isn't necessarily from any sort of framework. So we've previously been working with Bootstrap, but it doesn't mean that every site that's on the internet is going to be using Bootstrap. And so we can see in here, as we're going through, that each of these is basically a section. And as we're going through and figuring out how these templates work, it's mostly just a matter of playing around with them to see what's going on. So just keep that in mind whenever you're picking, when you're picking templates. If you do use HTML5up, they're pure CSS and HTML. So your Bootstrap stuff, you'll have to start from the ground up, figuring out how everything works. So the other option that we have is Start Bootstrap, which is another site. Keep in mind that this site does sell like actual pro templates that you'd have to buy. And so if you do go on their website, just be very careful that you don't go to any of their premium templates, because if you pay for those and then you try and distribute the code, it's actually against their license. Just be very careful when you're going through. So what we've done is we've actually picked a couple of the themes here that all use the MIT license. So we can see here, if we click on resume and we click on the live preview, we can see in here that this one is actually using the MIT license, which is stated right here. So we know that we can use it as we please. And then this one is just a fancy resume site where we have all these different sections, and we can just do the same thing where we go through and download the files and go from there. So there's a couple of other options. These are in order of complexity. So the resume one is probably the easiest one to understand what's going on, then modern business, then stylish portfolio, so on and so forth. They all use Bootstrap, but it doesn't mean that Bootstrap can't get complicated as well. So just keep that in mind as you're going through. Now, some tips for going through this code, because what we're going to do after this is we're going to give you guys a chance to go through and download one of these sites, and then just go through and start playing around with the templates and start building out a site. You can do it on any topic you want, but I would highly recommend picking sort of a site about yourself, because hopefully everybody knows enough about themselves to be able to write information, but maybe that's a bit of a leap, but hopefully everybody has enough information to be able to write a site, because that's kind of what I was hoping on. But when you're going through these sites, keep in mind, we've picked sites intentionally that have comments and classes that should help you. So as we're looking at this, for example, we can see in here that there are comments that tell you what each thing is doing. So this is a wrapper around the page. There's another wrapper inside of it. And then we have like a panel here that has a banner on it. And if we go ahead and we pop open the code in here, we can see, oh, look, like this section right here. Okay, I can see. So this is the section, this is the wrapper. So this section corresponds to this part right here. So you can use the highlighting to figure out what's going on. And we can collapse this and see, okay, so this is the first section. This is the second section. All right, that makes sense. That's all in there. And if you're wondering about the CSS, you can see on the right here that this is basically going to give you all the CSS and what's happening with the CSS. So you can see here, it's a lot longer of CSS than what we're used to. And for some of these things, you probably have to Google them. But the other handy thing is that it gives you where in the file it's located. So you can see here, main.css, line 2100. So we can click on that and we can see, okay, this is where it is. And then now we can come into our CSS and we can see assets, CSS, main, and it was line 2100. So we can scroll down. Cool. All right. So this is where that thing was, which is right there. And so a lot of this is going to be, again, just taking things apart, messing around with it, seeing what happens. And oftentimes, even with experienced developers, everybody writes their code a little bit differently. So this is a lot of what you're going to be doing whenever you're writing websites, even if you're dealing with people's websites that already exist, is going to be trying to figure out, okay, what did the last person actually do? And so that's kind of what this exercise is for today. And another thing to keep in mind as well is that don't just try to like look at the website and just try and do the entire website all at once. Look at the different pieces and then plan out how each piece is going to be developed and then go from there. So like, as I'm looking at this page, for example, I can see, okay, this section right here, I don't care about what's going on to the right of this. I'm just going to try and figure out this first panel. Okay, so I need to figure out, okay, so there's an image here. Let me go and get an image. Cool. All right. Now I need to figure out, okay, what am I going to put in here? Maybe I'm going to just say in here, you know, hello, my name is Kieran. And then I'm just going to go from there. I'm just going to build it up as I go. Yeah, okay, hello, my name is Kieran, cool. So that's where that is. Okay, now I can go back to my HTML and I can figure it out. Or if I want to export it, I can just right click and then click copy element, and then I can just copy that element and go from there. Any of these approaches are fine, but basically just take it one section at a time. Don't try and like attack the entire site all at once. Don't be like, okay, cool. So we got like 8 sections here. All right, so I'm going to need 15 images. All right, I'm going to need to include this. I'm going to need to do this. Just take it one piece at a time and go from there. Figure out how those one pieces work and build up. Another thing as well is that the code, when you're looking at it, can sometimes get a little bit long and confusing. So if I'm going through, I'm taking a look at the index code here. We can see here, there's a ton of these different sections. And then when we come down to this last section, there's a super long one. And it's really hard to figure out, okay, like I've already lost where I am in the code. So one thing that you can do is if you come back up here, you know, okay, this is the one that's super long right here. I'm just going to come through and I'm just going to minimize that for the time being. And I'm just going to minimize. So this one's super long as well. I'll deal with this later. I'll deal with this one later. Okay, I'm just going to focus on this one for the time being. And now when you're scrolling through your code, instead of dealing with whatever it was, 500 lines of code, now you're just dealing with 70 to try and understand. So really go through, break everything up, chunk it up, and then start trying to work through it. How did I get the yellow, green, purple lines? That is a program, that's an extension that I have called indent something. It's called indent rainbow is what it's called. I mostly use it for Python. If you want to install it as well, if it's helpful, then you can do that as well. And also as a heads up with Visual Studio Code as well, this is another thing that might help you. You can see here when I click on this section thing, it actually highlights the end of the section as well. So I can see which tag ends it. So if I click on this one, for example, it'll tell me which tag ends this one as well. It'll just highlight it for me. Okay, now the last most important thing, ask your mentors for help. Please don't just sit there in silence while trying to suffer, trying to figure out how to do anything. Please ask your mentors for any help that you guys need as you're going through this. This is essentially what you would find a lot of times more in a real world situation where you sort of be thrown into a code base. So be sure to ask people for help as you're going through it. We're not expecting you to be able to just like sit down and just like, oh, okay, now I'm just going to quickly do this and just have it done. No, just ask your questions as you go. So on top of that, which is what we're going to do in a second, there are also just some resources that I've left here for you guys to be able to find other things that you might need. So images, for example, there are 3 different places you can get some good images for. So Pixabay is one. So pixabay.com, you can basically come in here, you can find some images, you can search for images. These are all essentially open source photos. The only exception is that you can't create another Pixabay using their photos. Same thing with Unsplash. So you can't recreate a place to sell images by using their photos. But other than that, I assume nobody's going to do that. So other than that, you can basically use them however you want. Unsplash is another good one. So Unsplash on here, you can search for things. Just keep in mind when you are searching for things, like if I search for like office building on here, they got bought by another company right before I made these slides. And so I haven't included it in here. Avoid these things that say Unsplash Plus. These are the only ones that don't apply to this. Everything else is open source. This is the only stuff that isn't. So avoid anything that says Unsplash Plus. They literally changed this last month because Getty bought them. So I didn't have time to update the slides. So just keep that in mind. And the last one is get avatars. This is just a easy way to generate an avatar you want, and then you can just like right click and save it. So super easy. You can use those in your projects as well. And the last thing we actually talked about before, does license disappear? Yeah, don't do that. So the last thing is icons. Basically, I would just use the Bootstrap ones because we talked about it last week. They're probably the easiest ones to use, and you've already seen how to use them. So you can always reference back to the slides last week to be able to use those icons from there. These other ones are decent as well, but just keep in mind that they're a bit more complicated in terms of the licensing. So just be careful. So exercise. You guys are going to go through and you're going to have time. You're going to have a ton of time to build a site. So we're just going to give you time to build that out. We recommend one of these 3 from HTML5 up if you want to go that route, or alternatively, like I said before, if you come back up to the slides here for Start Bootstrap, I would recommend either like one of the first 3, or you can do the last 2 if you want. They're going to be a little bit more complicated as you're dealing with them. But these ones are based on Bootstrap, which you guys already know a bit of, so it might be a little bit easier. Or if you want a bit more challenge, but a bit more fanciness, then you can try one of these 3. And basically, we're just going to give you a chance, just go through, try and build them out from there. And again, ask your mentors for help if you have any questions. So we're going to go into breakout rooms and let you guys give that a shot. Did not restart the recording. I've restarted the recording. So yeah, like I said, these are super handy for being able to build up sites super quickly. This is just done while we were in the breakout rooms there. And the main thing that's often difficult with a lot of building sites, you'll find, is the content. There's obviously the technical aspect of actually building the site, but also building the content itself. And one of the things that I mentioned to one of the groups while I was in there that I figured I'd bring across here is that sometimes when you're picking these designs and you're trying to go through and decide what you want to do. Another thing that's super handy with these template sites is that you can just get an idea for what sort of a feel you want to go for with your sites. So if I'm looking at like Paradigm Shift, for example, like this is kind of the site that I would expect somebody who's like, I don't know, let's say if they're like a YouTube creator or something like that who asked me to do a site for them, this might be sort of a similar design that I would go for. Something that's flashy, that's out there, that would catch people's attention, especially people who want to work with them. I might do something like this. Or if I'm looking at some of these other sites like Ethereal, it'll be the same sort of thing with like somebody who's creative. If they're super creative, they have a bunch of pictures, they have a bunch of images. Like on mine, as I'm scrolling through here, this image section is the majority of the site. So if somebody who's like a photographer, then using a site like that might be super handy. And those sorts of things aren't really anything that we can necessarily teach you, but as you're going through and building sites, you can find that the design that you use for a site can really impact the way that people perceive your content. So just keep that in mind whenever you're picking your sites. And these templates make it super easy for you to iterate without wasting time. You're not spending 3 hours trying to do a design at the same time as you're trying to get your CSS to work, at the same time as you're trying to get this stuff to work. Like you have an idea of what it looks like, what you want, the vibe you're going for, and then you just build. So super handy. definitely make use of these where you can, and just make sure that you're careful with the licensing whenever you're picking these out from there. So that is basically everything for today. So next week, we're going to talk about using more fancy JavaScript features and doing the same sort of thing that we did with the HTML templates, but with JavaScript, using other people's JavaScript and making sure that we know how to use our own JavaScript to make fancy features. Like, for example, here we have something where you can enter in some content, and or in this case, this would be, oh, sorry, this is like a filter. So you can go through, you can filter blog posts. That's all done with JavaScript. There's also some syntax highlighting in the blog posts that'll be done with JavaScript. Or even something really fancy, like, for example, being able to create a web page directly in the browser by using an editor inside the browser. So this is the sort of stuff that we're going to cover next week. We're going to show you how to do these sorts of things and build out the same sort of site that you just saw there. So yeah, I will hopefully see you guys there, and you guys can feel free to head off.